It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning. The birds were singing, and the sky was a big, happy blue. Jake Miller sat on his porch with a hot cup of coffee in his hands. He liked coffee a lot. It made him feel cozy and awake. Jake was new in this neighborhood. He moved into his little house just 1 month ago. When he picked this place, he thought, wow, this looks so quiet and nice. He dreamed of calm days and friendly waves from neighbors. But oh boy, was he wrong about that. Across the street lived a lady named Karen. Not just any Karen, but that Karen, you know the type. She was the kind of person who watched everything like a hawk. If your grass grew even a tiny bit too long, she'd grab a ruler and measure it. If a leaf from your tree fell on her perfect sidewalk, she'd march right over and bang on your door. Pick it up, she'd yell, her face all scrunched up. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Karen. She was loud, bossy, and always telling people what to do. But Jake, nobody knew much about him yet. He was a mystery, like a secret waiting to pop out of a box. Jake liked keeping things simple. He stayed quiet most of the time. Every day he worked on fixing up his little house. He painted the walls, hammered nails, and swept the porch. He didn't bother anyone. He just wanted to make his new home nice and comfy. But Karen, oh, she didn't like that one bit. Something about Jake made her curious, and not in a good way. Her sharp eyes watched him like he was up to no good. She'd peek out her window, her nose almost pressed to the glass, staring at him. What was it about Jake that bugged her so much? You'll find out soon. I promise it's a fun surprise. Let's paint a picture of that morning. Jake was sitting there sipping his coffee. It was warm in his hands, and the steam floated up to his nose. He wore a plain blue shirt and old jeans, nothing fancy. His house was small but cute, with a red door and a little garden out front. He'd been planting flowers there, hoping they'd grow big and colorful. Across the street, Karen's house was perfect. Too perfect, maybe. Her grass was cut just right. Her mailbox shone like it was brand new, and her windows sparkled in the sun. She loved rules, and she loved making sure everyone else followed them too. That Saturday, Jake was minding his own business, as usual. He looked at his flowers and smiled. These are growing good, he thought. He didn't know trouble was brewing just a few steps away. Karen was already awake, standing on her porch. She had her arms crossed and her eyes locked on Jake's house. She didn't like how he did things. His flowers were nice, sure, but something about him rubbed her the wrong way. Maybe it was how calm he was. Maybe it was how he didn't care about her silly rules. Whatever it was, Karen's eagle eyes twitched every time she saw him. She was like a detective in a movie, always looking for clues. Now let me tell you a little more about Jake. He wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't talk much to the neighbors yet. When people walked by, he'd give a small wave and a friendly, hi. That was it. He wasn't trying to hide anything, or was he? See, Jake had a secret. Not a bad secret, but a cool one. Nobody knew it yet, not even Karen. He was happy keeping it to himself for now, like a kid with a hidden toy. But secrets don't stay secret forever, right? And this one was going to shake things up big time. Back to that morning, everything seemed normal at first. Kids rode their bikes down the street, laughing and racing. A dog barked somewhere nearby. Jake took another sip of his coffee and leaned back in his chair. He liked this quiet life. He didn't want drama or fights. But Karen, she lived for drama. She loved being in charge. If something wasn't just how she wanted it, she'd make a big fuss. And Jake, well, he was about to become her next big fuss. She didn't know it yet, but he was more than just a guy with a coffee cup and a red door. Here's where it gets fun. Karen had been watching Jake for weeks. Ever since he moved in, she'd been keeping an eye on him. She didn't trust new people. Who is this guy? She'd mutter to herself. Why's he so quiet? She didn't like quiet. Quiet made her nervous. She liked knowing everything about everyone. But Jake didn't give her much to work with. He didn't throw loud parties. He didn't leave trash cans out too long. He was just there. And that drove Karen crazy. Her twitchy eyes couldn't figure him out, and that made her grumpy. So on that sunny Saturday, Jake was chilling, enjoying his day. He had no idea what was coming. Karen, though, she was already planning something. She stood on her porch, tapping her foot, staring at his house. She didn't like his window frame. It was the wrong color, she thought. Too bright, she'd complain to herself. It doesn't match the rules. She was the boss of the HOA, the group that made all the neighborhood rules. And she took her job very seriously. To her, Jake's window was a problem, a big annoying problem. But here's the thing, Jake wasn't worried. He didn't care about Karen's rules. He liked his window just fine. It was white and clean, and that was good enough for him. He didn't know Karen was about to make a big deal out of it. He didn't know she'd call the cops over something so tiny. And he really didn't know the cops were already on their way. Not for him, but for her. Yep, that's the twist coming up. It's going to be wild, so stick around. Oh, and hey, you watching this right now? I've got a question for you. What would you do if someone called the cops on you for something super silly, like a window frame? Would you laugh? Get mad? Hide under your bed? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm super curious to hear what you think. And if you like stories like this, hit that subscribe button so we can hang out more. Jake's story is just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. What's Karen up to? And what's Jake's big secret? Keep watching, friends. It's about to get good. Karen didn't like Jake one bit, and it started the very first day he moved in. She stood on her porch, her arms crossed tight, staring at his house like it was a big problem. Your window frame's the wrong shade of white. She shouted across the street. Her voice was loud and sharp, like a teacher scolding a kid. She waved her phone in the air, holding it up high, as if she was about to call someone super important, like the president. Jake heard her yelling, but he didn't get upset. He just stood by his red door, smiled a little, and gave her a friendly wave. That was it. Just a wave. But oh boy, that made Karen even madder. Karen's face turned redder every time she saw Jake. She didn't like how calm he was. She didn't like how he didn't argue back. Most people would yell or say something mean, but not Jake. He was cool as a cucumber, and that drove Karen nuts. One sunny afternoon, she couldn't take it anymore. She marched right across the street, her shoes stomping on the pavement. Her face was as red as a big ripe tomato. She stopped right in front of Jake's house and pointed at his window. "I'm with the HOA," she snapped. The HOA was the group that made all the rules for the neighborhood, and Karen loved being the boss of it. "I say that frame's an eyesore. It's ugly, and it's wrong. Fix it, or I'll report you," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Jake was outside, watering his flowers when she came over. He looked up at her, still holding the watering can. Water dripped onto the ground, making little puddles. He tilted his head and shrugged his shoulders. "It's just a window, ma'am," he said, nice and easy. His voice was soft, like he didn't have a care in the world. That was all he said, just those few words. But to Karen, it was like he'd thrown a big bucket of water in her face. Her eyes got wide, and her mouth opened like she couldn't believe it. Just a window, she thought. To her, it wasn't just a window. It was a rule being broken, and she hated that more than anything. Karen stormed back to her house, muttering to herself, "He thinks he can ignore me. Oh, I'll show him," she grumbled. She didn't know it yet, but Jake wasn't scared of her at all. He wasn't just some random guy who moved in with a truck and some boxes. Nope, Jake had a little secret hiding up his sleeve, like a magic trick waiting to happen. It was something big, something that would make Karen wish she'd never opened her mouth. But for now, she had no clue. She thought she was the queen of the street, and Jake was just a nobody she could boss around. The next day, Karen was at it again. She stood on her porch, sipping tea from a fancy cup, watching Jake like a hawk. He was outside, painting a little table for his porch. The sun was shining, and he hummed a happy tune while he worked. Karen squinted her eyes and shook her head. "That window's still wrong," she yelled. Jake looked up, paintbrush in his hand, and waved again. Same smile, same wave. Karen's tea almost spilled because she was so mad. Why doesn't he listen, she thought. She wanted him to jump up, grab a ladder, and fix that window right away. But Jake, he just kept painting his table, like her yelling was no big deal. This went on for days. Every time Karen saw Jake, she found something to complain about. "Your grass is too long," she'd shout. Jake would nod and keep mowing. "Your mailbox is crooked," she'd holler. Jake would smile and fix it later. Nothing she said made him mad or scared. That made the tension between them grow bigger and bigger, like a balloon about to pop. Karen thought she was winning. She thought Jake was weak because he didn't fight back. But she was wrong. Oh, so wrong. Jake wasn't weak. He was smart. And that secret he had, it was getting ready to come out. One time, Karen got really bold. She walked over to Jake's yard with a notebook in her hand. She started writing things down, pointing at his house like she was a teacher grading a test. "This window's bad. This flower's too tall. This porch needs paint," she said, her pencil scratching fast. Jake watched her from his doorstep, leaning against the wall. "You're busy today, huh?" he said with a little laugh. Karen glared at him. "You think this is funny? I'm reporting you to the HOA tomorrow," she barked. Jake just nodded, like he wasn't worried at all. "Okay, ma'am," he said, and went back inside. Karen thought she had him trapped now. She smiled to herself as she walked away, her notebook full of complaints. "He'll learn who's in charge," she thought. But here's the fun part. She didn't know Jake wasn't afraid of her reports. He wasn't shaking in his boots or packing his bags. Why? Because that secret up his sleeve was bigger than any HOA rule. It was something that would turn everything upside down. Karen thought she was the hunter, chasing Jake like a cat after a mouse. But really, Jake was the one waiting, calm and quiet, ready to surprise her when she least expected it. The tension kept building. Every day Karen got louder. Every day Jake stayed cooler. Neighbors started to notice. "Why's Karen so mad at the new guy?" they'd whisper. "He seems nice," they'd say. But Karen didn't care what anyone thought. She was on a mission to make Jake follow her rules or leave. She'd stand on her porch, arms crossed, staring at his house. She'd call her HOA friends and complain about him. "He's ruining our street," she'd say. Meanwhile, Jake kept living his life, watering flowers, sipping coffee, fixing his house. He didn't argue, he didn't yell, he just smiled. And that smile, it was driving Karen up the wall.
What Karen didn't see was how Jake watched her too. Not in a mean way, but in a quiet, careful way. He noticed how she bossed everyone around. He heard her yell at the mailman one day. He saw her shake her fist at a kid riding a bike too fast. Jake didn't say much, but he was paying attention. That secret of his was like a puzzle piece, and he was waiting for the right moment to put it in place. Karen thought she was the big boss, but she was about to find out she wasn't as smart as she thought. The fight over a silly window frame was just the start, and it was going to get wild. Weeks went by, and things got crazier in the neighborhood. Karen didn't stop. She got nosier every single day. She was like a sneaky cat, always watching Jake. She'd stand by her fence peeking over the top with her sharp eyes. Sometimes she'd grab a little notebook and scribble stuff down fast. "His window's still ugly," she'd mutter to herself. "He's not following my standards." Standards were her favorite word. She wanted everything perfect, her way. Jake saw her spying, but he didn't say anything. He just kept doing his own thing, like nothing was wrong. One afternoon, it got even wilder. The sun was high in the sky, and Jake was outside fixing his porch steps. He had a hammer in one hand and nails in the other. Bang, bang, bang. He was making those steps strong. Then out of nowhere he looked up and saw Karen. She wasn't just peeking this time, she was taking pictures. Yep, full-on detective mode. She held her phone up, snapping photos of his window like she was collecting clues for a big case. Click, click, click. Jake caught her in the act, and couldn't help it. He chuckled. A little laugh popped out, quiet and happy. Karen didn't hear him, but he shook his head and kept working. She's something else, he thought. See, Jake wasn't just fixing his house for fun. Sure, he liked making it nice, painting the walls, planting flowers, hammering stuff. But there was more to it. While Karen watched him, Jake was watching her too. Not in a sneaky way, but in a smart way. He noticed how she acted with everyone. She didn't just boss him around, she bossed the whole street. If someone parked their car a tiny bit wrong, she'd yell. If a kid left a toy outside, she'd complain. Jake saw it all, and he kept it in his head like a list. He was quiet, but he wasn't missing a thing. Little hints started popping up, like surprises in a game. One day Jake was in his yard pulling weeds. A delivery guy came by with a package for Karen. She stormed out of her house, her face up. "You're late," she shouted at the poor guy. He tried to say sorry, but she cut him off. "I've got connections, you know," she said, loud and proud. "I can get you in trouble." The delivery guy just nodded and ran off fast. Jake heard every word from his yard. He pulled another weed and smirked, a tiny secret smile. "Connections, huh?" he thought. That's funny, because Jake had some connections of his own, and they were way bigger than Karen's. They were about to come knocking, but not yet. He wasn't ready to show his cards. Karen kept getting bolder. Another day she walked right up to Jake's fence with her notebook again. She stood there, writing and muttering. "His grass is messy. His flowers are too wild," she said under her breath. Jake was inside, looking out his window, the one she hated so much. He saw her there, acting like she owned his yard. He didn't get mad though. He just watched, sipping water from a glass. She's really into this, he thought. He could have gone out and told her to stop, but he didn't. Why? Because Jake had a plan. He was waiting like a kid holding a water balloon, ready to drop it at the perfect time. The neighborhood started buzzing a little. People talked about Karen and Jake. Why's she so mad at him? A lady asked while walking her dog. "He's nice, he waves at me," said a guy riding his bike. Everyone saw Karen being loud and bossy, but Jake, he was the opposite. He stayed calm, fixing his house, smiling at folks. That made Karen even grumpier. She didn't like that people weren't on her side. They'll see, she thought. I'll make him fix that window, or he's out of here. She was sure she'd win, but those little hints Jake kept noticing. They were building up to something big. One morning Jake was sweeping his porch. The broom went swish, swish, swish across the wood. Karen came outside too, holding a big cup of coffee. She stared at him, her eyes narrow. Then she yelled, "You think you're so smart, huh? Ignoring my rules." Jake looked up, broom in hand, and shrugged. "Just cleaning, ma'am," he said, nice as pie. Karen huffed and stomped back inside. Jake watched her go, and that smirk came back. He knew something she didn't. He wasn't ignoring her rules because he was lazy or mean. He was ignoring them because they didn't matter, not to him, and not to his secret. See, Jake wasn't just a guy with a hammer and some paint. He was watching Karen for a reason. Every time she yelled at someone, he paid attention. Every time she bragged about her connections, he listened. He saw how she treated people, like she was the queen, and they were her servants. Jake didn't like that. He didn't say it out loud, but he thought, she's not as big as she thinks, and those connections she talked about, they were nothing compared to what Jake had waiting. His secret was like a surprise party, and Karen didn't even know she was invited. The days kept going, and Karen kept spying. She'd hide behind her curtains, peeking out at Jake's house. She'd take more pictures, write more notes. One time she even measured his mailbox with a ruler. "Too tall," she grumbled. Jake saw her from his garden and waved like always. Karen glared back, her ruler shaking in her hand. She thought she was getting closer to winning. She thought her notes and pictures would scare Jake into doing what she wanted. But Jake wasn't scared. He was ready. Ready for what? "Oh, you'll see, it's coming soon." Those little hints kept adding up. Karen yelling at the delivery guy. Karen bragging about her power. Karen acting like she ruled the world. Jake saw it all, and he kept it quiet. He didn't fight back. He didn't yell. He just worked on his house and smiled. Why? Because he knew something big was coming. His connections, the real ones, were getting closer. They weren't just friends or neighbors. They were something way more exciting. Karen thought she was the boss, but Jake was holding the real power. And when it showed up, she'd wish she'd never peeked over that fence. It all happened on a Friday, a day that started normal but turned wild fast. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and Jake was outside in his yard. He was pulling some weeds, just keeping his little garden nice. Across the street, Karen was on her porch, and she'd finally had enough. She couldn't stand Jake's ugly window frame anymore. That white frame she hated so much. It was like a monster in her dreams. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking with anger, and dialed 911 right then and there. She didn't even care who heard her. "There's a code violation at 23 Maple Street." She shouted into the phone. "Send someone now. It's an emergency." Her voice was loud like a siren bouncing off the houses. Jake heard her yelling from his yard. He stopped pulling weeds and stood up straight. He wiped his hands on his jeans and shook his head like he couldn't believe it. Over a window, he thought. He didn't say anything out loud though. He just watched her, calm as ever. Karen paced back and forth on her porch, still holding the phone. She was so sure she'd won this time. "They'll make him fix it now," she thought. "The cops will come and he'll have to listen to me." She even grinned a little, her teeth showing, thinking she was the big winner. Oh, but here's where it gets good. There was a twist coming, and it was a big one. Before Karen even hung up the phone, while she was still talking, a police car rolled up the street. Its lights weren't flashing, but it moved fast and stopped right in front of their houses. Karen's eyes lit up like it was Christmas morning. She put her phone down and clapped her hands. Finally, she said out loud, "They're here for him." She leaned over her porch railing, waiting to see the cops march over to Jake's house. She thought they'd knock on his red door. "There, come, fix that window, or you're in trouble." She was so excited she almost danced. Jake just stood there in his yard, watching the car too. He didn't look scared. He didn't run inside. He just waited. But then, surprise, the cops didn't go to Jake's house. Nope, they got out of the car, two of them, wearing their dark uniforms and shiny badges. They walked straight past Jake's yard, their boots thumping on the pavement. They headed right for Karen's porch. Her grin disappeared fast. Her mouth opened a little, like she didn't know what was happening. The officers stopped at her steps, looking up at her. One of them, a tall guy with a serious face, said, "Karen Thompson." His voice was deep and strong. Karen blinked hard. Yes," she said, her voice wobbly now. The officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs, shiny silver ones, and held them up. "We need to talk to you," he said. Karen's jaw dropped so low, it almost hit the floor. "What's this about?" she screeched, her voice high and squeaky. She stepped back, bumping into her porch chair. The chair wobbled, and she grabbed it to steady herself. Her face went from red to white in 2 seconds flat. She looked at the cops, then at Jake, then back at the cops. "This is a mistake," she yelled. "I called you. He's the problem." She pointed at Jake, her finger shaking. But the officers didn't even look at him. They climbed her steps, slow and steady, like they knew exactly what they were doing. Jake watched from his yard, his arms crossed, a tiny smile on his face. He wasn't surprised at all. Here's the big reveal, the moment everything flipped upside down. Turns out, Jake wasn't just a quiet neighbor with a hammer and some flowers. Nope, he was an undercover cop. That's right, a real police officer, hiding in plain sight. He'd been living there, fixing his house, waving at people, all while keeping a big secret. And Karen, she wasn't as perfect as she thought. For years she'd been dodging fines, money she owed for breaking rules. She'd parked in places she shouldn't, ignored bills, and even lied about stuff to the city. She thought her connections would save her, but she was wrong. Jake had been watching her the whole time, building a case like a detective in a movie. Karen didn't know any of this until that moment. She thought Jake was just some guy she could boss around. She thought her HOA power made her untouchable. But while she was yelling about his window, Jake was writing down everything she did wrong. Every time she peeked over his fence, every time she took pictures, every time she bragged about her connections. He saw it all. He didn't need to argue with her. He didn't need to fix his window. He was waiting for the right day, and that Friday was it. The cops weren't there for a silly window frame. They were there for her. The tall officer started talking again. "You've got a bunch of unpaid fines, ma'am," he said, "and we've got reports of you breaking rules all over town." Karen shook her head fast. No, that's not true," she cried. But the other officer, a lady with short hair, pulled out a paper. "It's all right here," she said, holding it up. Karen's eyes got wide, like she'd seen a ghost. She tried to grab the paper, but the lady pulled it back. "You're coming with us," the tall officer said. He held up the handcuffs again, and they clicked as he opened them. Karen screeched louder. "This is crazy. He's the one you want." She pointed at Jake again, but the cops didn't care. Jake just stood there, cool and quiet. He didn't need to say a word. His secret was out now, and it was awesome. The neighbors started peeking out their windows, watching the show. Kids stopped riding their bikes to stare. Everyone saw Karen yelling, and the cops on her porch. They saw Jake, calm as ever, like he knew this was coming. And he did. He'd been ready for this day, waiting for Karen to trip over her own big mouth. The officers took a step closer to Karen. "Let's go, Mom," the lady cop said. Karen backed up more, but there was nowhere to run. Her perfect porch wasn't so perfect anymore. Her fancy coffee cup sat on the railing, cold and forgotten. She looked at Jake one last time, her eyes full of shock. "You," she said, like she couldn't believe it. Jake just shrugged, that tiny smile still there. "Have a good day, Mom," he said, nice and polite. That was it, the big twist. Karen thought she was the hunter, but Jake was the real hero, and her game was over. The neighborhood was buzzing like a beehive after the cops showed up. Everyone peeked out their windows, or stood on their porches, whispering to each other. Karen was still yelling, trying to wiggle out of trouble. "This is a mistake," she cried, her voice loud and whiny. "I'm the victim here, he's the bad guy." She pointed at Jake, her finger shaking like a leaf in the wind. But the cops didn't listen. They'd heard enough. The tall officer shook his head, and the lady cop said, "No more talking, Mom." They took her by the arms, nice but firm, and walked her down the steps. Karen kept squirming, but it was no use. They opened the police car door, and loaded her right in. The door shut with a loud click, and that was that. Jake watched it all from his yard. He leaned against his window frame, the one Karen hated so much, holding his coffee cup. The coffee was still warm, and he took a slow sip, like it was just another normal day. He didn't cheer or laugh. He didn't need to. His secret was out, and the job was done. The police car started up, its engine humming, and drove off with Karen in the back. She pressed her face to the window, still yelling, but no one could hear her anymore. The street got quiet again, except for the birds chirping and a kid giggling somewhere nearby. Later that day, something cool happened. A letter came in the mail for Jake. It was from the HOA, the group Karen used to boss around. He opened it up and read it slow. Guess what? They were glad Karen was gone. The letter said they'd had problems with her for a long time. She'd been mean to everyone, making rules that didn't even make sense. Now that Jake's secret had cleaned things up, they thanked him. "You're a good neighbor," the letter said. Jake smiled and tucked it away. His little secret didn't just fix his problem, it made the whole street better. After that, things changed fast. Neighbors who used to ignore Jake started acting different. Before they'd walk by his house without a word. Now they waved big and smiled wide. One old guy with a grey beard stopped by while Jake was watering his flowers. "Should have known you were too calm to be ordinary," he said, chuckling. "You're a sneaky one." Jake just grinned and nodded. "Just like it quiet," he said. The guy laughed and patted Jake's shoulder before walking off. Another lady brought him cookies the next day. "Thanks for getting rid of her," she whispered, like it was a secret. Jake took the cookies and said, "No trouble." He liked the quiet, and now he had it. The street felt lighter, like a big storm had passed. Kids played outside without Karen yelling at them. People parked their cars wherever they wanted. Jake kept fixing his house, painting and planting, and no one complained about his window frame anymore. He'd sip his coffee every morning, leaning on that ugly frame, and watch the world go by. Peace at last, real peace, and all because Jake stayed calm and let his secret do the work. Karen was gone, the rules were fair again, and everyone was happy, especially Jake. So here's the thing, friends. Sometimes the person you think is just there is actually the one with all the power. Think about Jake and Karen for a second. Karen looked at Jake and saw a quiet guy with an ugly window frame. She judged him fast, like she knew everything. She thought he was nobody special, just a neighbor she could boss around. But she was so wrong. Jake was holding all the cards, like a kid with a secret stash of candy. He didn't brag or show off, he just waited. And when the time was right, bam, he turned everything around. Karen never saw the real him coming, and that's what made it so cool. This makes you wonder, doesn't it? Who's out there in your world quietly winning? Maybe it's the kid at school who doesn't talk much, but always gets good grades. Or the person next door who seems boring but has a big surprise up their sleeve. People like Karen look at the outside, like a window frame or a plain shirt, and think they've got it all figured out. But the outside isn't the whole story. The real stuff, the important stuff, hides inside where you can't see it right away. Jake taught us that. He was calm and quiet, but he was strong too. He didn't need to yell or fight. He just let the truth come out when it was ready.